And so I'm live with his Jeffness.
Hey.
And Jeff says he managed to get through the ESFP video I did.
I did.
What were your initial? What are your initial thoughts on it, Jeff?
I was afraid you were going to ask me something like that. I liked the parts where you talked about me, and liked when you did the Pemberton quote that I provided to you.
Yes, thank you.
I remember there was a long period of time where you had a graphic up about, what was it called, like NT Counter Club or something?
Yeah.
And I was completely lost during that part, so that's part of the reason I kind of drifted off, is I didn't really get what you were talking about there, but
yeah, it's
but that's kind of usual. Like, it's as we've talked about before, the closer something is to like application to real things that I know, the more I'm gonna be able to follow it, and the more it's a bunch of letters and numbers flying around, then the less that I can follow it or have interest in it. So.
Yeah. So the idea is that sort of like the counter club is like the 4 functions which are furthest away from your sort of home base of. So it's like the idea being that because you have a preference for sensing, that you theoretically you're good at SE, but you're all right at SI, and you value FI, but you can do some FE. So, for example, the bit where, what was it? Was it that one? No, it wasn't that one. There was a bit where, that's it, where I sort of like took this bit from Kersey, and this was from the ESFP profile, where they could do all of these things that can describe ESFP, that say ENFJ and ESFJ can also do these things, but ESFP is using them for a different reason. Do you think that? I mean, it is from the Kersey profile. So do you agree that with this bit that? Do you agree with these quotes from Kersey, from the Kersey ESFP profile? That these are things that ESF people can do?
Yeah, at least that's what we're trying to do. Not necessarily always successful. And of course, I did a video all about that, of preferences versus reality, because that's the thing about all this stuff, is it's like, this is what naturally we like to do or prefer to do, but it doesn't mean that it always works out perfectly. So right. If you just view someone's behavior and from a point of view of, well, the things they're actually able to successfully do form their personality, then you could have a whole different set of types, because that's really a different thing than preferences. But it's impossible to really measure probably how many people or what percentage of people are generally successful. But it's like in sports, in baseball, if you hit 300, that means you got to hit 30% of the time, and that's considered actually pretty successful. So there's quite a few things where, when it comes to like lifting other spirits or pleasing others as a performer, like, you can have a lot of times that you're not successful in doing that, and then if you do it once, then with one person or a small group of people, then it can seem like you're like that all the time, or in my case, I feel like I sort of get a buzz from that, and it lasts. If somebody tells me that they thought that something I did was funny, or they just enjoyed whatever it was, then I can kind of stay happy off that for a while. It doesn't take having to do it constantly.
So what I would say is that the 4 types that have E and F in their code, so all those people with a a preference for extroverting and a preference for feeling, that they're pretty good at all of these sort of things, but it's a question of valued and unvalued. So in the case of ESFP, they're sort of doing these things. I mean, yes, they like people, but they're also doing it for the attention, for it's almost like for artisan reasons. And when, say, whereas ESFJ or ENFJ, they're doing these things for more of these kind of like, what people talk about as FE reasons, sort of like your focus of attention is on other people and other people's needs, or we could say,
yeah, kind of more caretaking.
Yeah. Or in the case of ENFJ, that might be on, say, a spiritual level or psychological level, mental health, that sort of thing. And the ESFJ is more about beneficence and like as you say, actively taking care of somebody, sort of a paternalistic kind of role.
Yeah, I mean, I think like with the SFJs, they almost, they not even almost, they have like a feeling of a duty or an obligation to take care of people, whereas SPs in general don't really like duties and obligations. So if it feels too much like that, we're less likely to want to do it. But if it feels like we're doing something fun that people enjoy, then that's the important part, and then we like doing it.
Yeah, I also think it
doesn't mean that we don't want to take care of people or don't want people to have their needs met or whatever, but we just have a different approach to it.
Yeah, I think I remember you did the video with Kristen with an I rather than an E, and it was SFP Clubhouse, and it was about instinctively helping people, and she was talking about doing things for the church, but she didn't want to do it as an obligation.
Right.
As a duty. She wanted to just do it as instinctive kindness in the moment. So the idea with the clubs is, and it was this guy called Vanderhoek, and somebody wrote, somebody in an ESTP group wrote, he was a German basketball player who was very good, so they called him Vanderhoek. So it would be like, theoretically, you're the opposite of me, and it's like, so Vanderhoek would say this is for INTP, where INTP is sort of good at all the NT functions and like barely aware of the SF functions, and for you it would be you're aware of the SF functions. So if I put that back to here, so it's like so for example, so in showing that bit before, you can, so I would say you and ESFPs, you can do FE stuff if you're so inclined, and it's usually for artisan reasons. I've actually got a slide for that. Is it that one? No, it's the next one. That's it. Like, so this bit here about the ability, being warm, being expressive, that sort of, sort of like the ability to read the emotions of the room and change the emotions of the room with sort of a charismatic sort of like warmth coming from the face and the voice. Do you agree that like EFs can do that? That sort of like be a warm person, like that sort of charisma.
Yeah, I think
across, so. Sort of on a feeling level. And so that would be the idea of, you can do FE stuff, or that part of FE that's about, like being expressive, and you can actually get.
Yeah, the part that I don't relate to is like where it's almost like another form of sensing. This is where like Morgan has talked about, like that's sort of reading the room, the emotions of the room and stuff like that. I'm less good at doing that sort of stuff.
Right.
I mean, I can try to do that, but it's sort of a guess. I don't really. It's harder for me to gauge that.
But do you think you've seen people in interviews who you've typed as ESFP, but you could say, oh, that performer's good at reading the room?
Well, to a point, but I think, when I thought Kersey had a really good point in the Brains and Careers where he talked about like needing the feedback. Like, so if you're not getting feedback, then it's much harder to tell. But I mean, if you're obviously getting a vocal or a visual response to something that's either appreciative or negative, then you can kind of shift what you're doing in response to that. But if you just are expected to sort of pick up some sort of vibes from people, that's a lot more difficult to do.
Another way I could put it is, so do you think that you're more aware of that kind of stuff, or ESFPs in general are more aware of that kind of stuff than, say, ESTPs?
More aware of what kind of stuff?
Well, the feelings of other people and like the...
No, I'm saying it's exactly the opposite. Like the ESTPs are able to do that better than I am.
Do you think that some ESFPs can sort of know what to do with that information? Like an ESTP might be able to sort of read the room and know what the feelings are, but they don't then know what to do with it? Or
yeah, well, again, to use Morgan because he's the one that's told me, more about this than anybody else. He said something like, then he views everything as problems to solve. So he immediately wants to use that as something to solve whatever the problem, is, find the cause of it. But the people that he's, perceiving this feelings from or whatever aren't necessarily as interested in doing that as he is. Like in some cases, they either don't want to do that or they just have a different perception of what needs to be done. So he'd be able to say it better than me, but that's sort of what it was about. So just being more aware of feelings of people around you doesn't necessarily mean that you that you care about them that much. It just means that you're aware of them.
Yeah, because that's what I'm thinking.
He's expressed frustration in some of that because he'll talk about people throwing their feelings at him. So
so whereas I think with you, because you've got that feeling preference, you have more of a focus of attention on feeling, then what information you do pick up from other people, you're not going to sort of dismiss it, or you'll give it more weight, maybe.
Yeah, I'm really big on I'm trying not to make assumptions about what other people are feeling. And the positive of that is that I don't jump to a bunch of wild conclusions and start telling people, well, this is what you need to do because you feel this way, or even worse, to say, oh, you say you don't feel this way, but you really do. You just don't know it. That kind of thing.
That's bad.
Annoying. But the downside, of course, of that is there are some people that aren't good at expressing what they're feeling. And so that person is kind of hoping somebody will kind of jump to a conclusion to help them out. And I'm less good at that. So that's the pro and the con of that situation. Because I try not to make those assumptions, and I want someone to express to me what it is they need. And then as soon as they do, then I'm all about, well, let's do what I can to help you. But if you don't tell me, I don't like to jump to a bunch of conclusions about it and say, well, this is what this person must be needing.
Okay. When you see other people that you've sort of typed as, say, ESFJ and ESFP, how do you compare their sort of people skills? Can you look at an ESFP and go, well, this person's an ESFP, but I can see them, they can do what ESFJ does? Well,
obviously, the skills always vary by the person, but in general, it seems like just in terms of what they're naturally good at, ESFJs will be better at establishing those sort of social networks of people. So, and it doesn't necessarily even have to be people that they connect with on a feeling way. It's just those are the people that are available. So I'm going to make them part of my network, a part of my family, however you want to call it. And I've seen that, there's a particular coworker I have that, his approach as a boss is sort of everybody who works for me is part of the family. And so I'm going to know everything about this person because everyone who's in the family, then I need to know this stuff. And he sort of uses that in the other direction. Whereas if they're doing something wrong, then he'll come down on them in a way where it's like, you're disappointing the family kind of thing, as opposed to as opposed to it being like a, more of an ESTJ kind of, come down with the hammer on you type of thing. It's more about appealing to that, hey, we're trying to work together here and you're kind of disrupting our ability to do that, as opposed to it being more of a personal thing. So that's the thing, is that sometimes my observation with extroverted feeling is it's less personal. That's what it seems like it is to me, that it's more like a group a way of looking at feelings, as in we're all sort of a part of this bigger thing. And whereas I think introverted feeling is much more like individualized.
Yeah, I think maybe there might be a difference with the NFJs. The NFJs, because they're idealists, might go towards the individual because that's like part of their focus of attention, like someone's psychology.
Yeah, to a point, but I still think they do try to relate it to, more of the group mentality. It's sort of like,
I agree with that.
Get to know the individual person, but then you're still kind of saying, okay, here's how that fits in this bigger thing.
I also think that if you have, like, say, an SFJ there in a work environment, they'll have that sort of like, they'll have their work hat on and think in that way. Maybe in their family and the people closer to them, they might do more of that personal stuff. So
yeah, and I think probably allow themselves to break down a little bit more. I don't mean like a complete breakdown, but I just mean like to express some of the personal things that are bothering them that they wouldn't necessarily do in a work setting or a group setting, because they're trying to kind of put on the brave face, as they say, and you're supposed to have a certain amount of whatever the word for it is. Your demeanor is supposed to not be like too emotional. And I experienced that too, because I think about in my work, if I really expressed everything that I felt, they would probably all think I was insane. And if it was my boss, they might have gotten rid of me a long time ago. So, so I do definitely restrain myself from expressing things at work.
So, Jeff, luckily enough, you have for this next bit, you have an INTP brother, and theoretically, the INTP is a type that has like SI here, and in a four-function model, they'll put it third. When you compare yourself to your older INTP brother, and you think about SI stuff, which I've got as sort of three different things, well, 3 or 4 different things. Like I always do the quote from you about guardians will mention their medical problems, will tell you about their medical problems, and so there is that aspect of the guardian being concerned with the inside of its body. And I just did a couple of hours ago, I did that Haley was saying that she sometimes doesn't feel her body, that she's so in her mind she doesn't feel her body at all. And Jonathan was saying a similar thing. So theoretically there's a bit where we can say that SI has something to do with internal bodily comfort and that lot. And then there's the bit about SI, which is like guardians tend to like novels with a lot of description. Other people might think it's way too much description, but it's evocative for them. And then there's the sort of the part of SI that is like from like the Kersey Guardian kind of SI. This kind of like trusting what has worked, seeking security, that kind of stuff. So these sort of like different flavors of SI. And so what I was wondering was, and we could also say with this comfort bit that it's like almost like the ability to take care of yourself and look after your health. How do you think you compare to your INTP brother when it comes to SI? Are there certain bits of it that he's better at and you're better at other parts, or is it something different?
I mean, that's hard for me to answer. Like, what do you mean?
Okay, if we do it in terms of self-preservation, I think you said in the past that because you were in the father role, you had to do a lot of logistical stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So, in terms of like self-preservation, it's hard to say. But okay, in that kind of like logistical stuff, say before you had kids, how did you compare to your INTP brother in terms of logistics?
Well, I mean, I would say probably in the areas that he is interested in or cares about, he probably is good at logistics in those things. But in terms of like, I mean, he's not really responsible for another person like that, as a parent or anything. But I mean, he still did things like, he had a roommate for a long time that was, not always great at keeping a job and paying his part of the rent and stuff. So he was able to continue to deal with that. So, I don't know if that's the kind of thing you mean or not, but I mean, I haven't had a lot of like discussions with him about that kind of stuff, so I don't really know for sure. But I know that he was able to take care of the basic things he needed to do in his life. Wasn't he wasn't like constantly struggling with money and stuff like that. He did get into some debt for a while, I think, but then he eventually got out of that. So he was obviously able to figure out what to do.
Yeah, sometimes it's hard to put it into words because we know these are like made up abstractions.
Well, yeah, I mean, like that's what I mean when you ask me a thing like when you talk about like SI stuff, I don't know what that is. Like you got to be more specific.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I tried to cram it in there, but sort of like
because really the only thing I can come up with for myself is mainly like my view of the past. When I got older, I was able to view the past more positively, whereas when I was younger, I just looked at it as a series of things I'd screwed up. So it was always a negative feeling of here's all these opportunities that I blew the chance to do something. Whereas when I got older, somewhere in the 25 to 30 range, I started to be able to think fondly back on things in the past and say, I didn't always screw everything up. Here's some things that I was able to still enjoy and take advantage of. So I was able to sort of see those things. So like my eyes were opened up to things that had been sort of closed off to me before. And you mentioned being a parent and stuff, as a single parent, of course, especially, it was like, well, there were just things I had to do. I had to learn how to take care of a child. And so it's obviously I sought a lot of help on that, but I still had to figure out things on the fly sometimes and figure out the best way to adapt it, because, you can read whatever books or listen to whoever so-called experts you want on children, but then your individual child is always going to throw things at you that you aren't prepared for. So you have to be able to deal with that.
Right. Yeah. I am prepared to say in this model that when it comes to certain types, like when it like cuts across a temperament like that, that I sort of say, okay, this is going to be weaker because like you've got these big sort of temperament differences in terms of like SE going towards excitement and audacity, and then SI being more cautious. and going towards an authority, and it's like you've got those opposite, both sensory but like opposite sort of approaches to the same experience. Right. So
Yeah. Well, I think, a difference that I see is like people that are more naturally preferring introverted sensing seem to. A lot of it is about comparisons to the old days, and that's why I cited Kevin James, a stand-up comedian, because and he's not the only one, but you see comedians where their entire act is basically like, hey, isn't today stuff crazy? Remember how it used to be where this and this was true? And that's like their entire basis for their comedy. In fact, last night I was watching a episode of In Living Color, and it was supposed to be stereotypes of different types of comedians, and they had the old guy played by David Allen Greer that his entire act was just saying, man, people today are crazy. And it was just like a series of things he said that exist that are crazy. So it was like, and my wife, she's crazy.
Yeah. The way I see it is, I see that as true, but I sort of see it as Kersey wrote something about guardians having associative speech and going from topic to topic to topic. And I made me think we could call that guardian NE, that sort of tangenting, but it's.
You could, but that would be dumb.
Yes. but it's on a concrete plane. It's going from like something concrete to something else complete.
Yeah. Whereas, and that right there is why I always caution against people trying to take like an out of context thing and attach function notation to it as if it's always just exists that way in a vacuum, disassociated from the person and the temperament of the person. Because you can have people jumping from topic to topic, but again, it's still very much about the factual stuff as opposed to being about jumping from concept to concept, And I made this point in several videos. I think that when people talk about trying to figure out just from someone what someone is talking about, whether they're intuitive or sensing preference, to me, and this was put in terms by Kersey, but I don't remember exactly the words. But I sort of look at it as the concrete preference people will always take the subjective and try to make it objective. Like, they take the concept and try to apply it to reality. Yeah. Whereas the intuitive preference people will do the opposite. They take the facts and then they try to apply them to concepts. They take it into that conceptual world to play with it over there. It's sort of like, so if you listen to a conversation that involves both, you hear each person sort of trying to steer the conversation in that direction.
Yeah. That's sort of what's happening now.
Yeah, exactly.
Was it personology? I'll try and find the bit on
and really it's that instinct, because it's the further it goes away from that, the harder it is to relate to. So, in intuitives, I'm sure listening to the Guardians just list a bunch of facts about their lives are starting to get more and more bored as they're listening to that. Like, why are they just listing facts? Why don't we talk about something interesting?
Yeah, I've got the bit here where Kersey mentions the speech. I'll just okay, it's towards the end.
And I think, like, this is things just popping in my head, but I think when it comes to so-called small talk, that artisans view it very much as that can be either boring or it can be useful. But if it's useful, it's like we grab onto a particular thing in that and take it in a direction that's more fun for us. So, and I see another one of my coworkers who's an ESTP do that all the time, where he's able very, very easily to adapt to either of those directions of a conversation, whether it's something that's more like about a general concept or something that's very specific facts that are being said. And then he's able to like sort of take what he wants from each of those directions and then use it for his own point or own story that he wants to tell.
Yeah, just seen some people, seen some comments here from people. That's on the. I'll try to. Yes, that's what. So for yeah, so I call that. Yeah. Yeah. Wait a minute. I'll get back to that. Yeah. So in terms of the word, so what I'm sort of saying is, they go, yeah. I mean, you probably noticed, Jess, that NPs can look sort of like they tangent from topic to topic, but it's like tend to be like abstract topics, and Guardians are sort of doing it on a concrete level. And so if you become, you know, if you want to get into function fetishism, you could say, oh, that's the Guardian, that's Guardian NE. That's what I like to call. But getting back to SI, there's sort of another way I can put it in sort of reverse, where I can sort of say, that's not right. Is it that one? Yeah. Where I could say that ISTJs can be quite good at that part of SE, which is about ISTJs and ISFJs can be quite good at paying attention to what they're doing. And so, as Dario would say, immersing in the present context, the ability to sort of pay attention. Do you think that's true? That an ISTJ,
I mean, yeah,
good at
pay attention to the details of the thing they're caring about. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, you know, obviously I think of work situations where they're doing a certain task and their job is to pay attention to making sure that task is done correctly. Then yeah, they're going to be paying attention better than anybody on that. But they also, because they're doing that, may miss a lot of other things because they're not focused on those other things. And my new boss is an ISTJ, and he's like, he definitely has, when he has his own agenda, he's very much, you know, focused on that. And so anything else that's introduced, it's sort of like he pauses, takes it in, but then goes back to his own agenda. So yeah. if it's not going to enhance what he's already trying to go towards, he's basically going to dismiss it. And he's not going to do it in a rude way. He's just going to like pause, consider the thing, and then if it's not helping towards the agenda he has, he just basically ignores it and goes on. Yeah,
and that's the thing, that this slot is sometimes called the ignoring position. So do you think that those SI DOMs can have a problem with situational awareness because they've got that agenda first and maybe miss?
Sometimes, yeah, because, you know, the particular person I was talking about has a habit of interrupting people when he feels like what he's trying to express is more important than whatever's being discussed. Like if he walks into a room and he perceives that the discussion is not something important, then he will interrupt it with his thing because he thinks it's more important.
Some of that can be ISTJ being a little bit blind to the room and other people's feelings, and ISFJ.
But they're still, yeah, they probably are. But even ISTJs are still better than me at knowing what the etiquette is in a lot of situations, because it's just that overall Guardian thing of you have to know what the proper behavior is in every situation.
Yeah. Okay. So.
So that's the kind of thing where I talked about like ESFJs being different in a social situation. ISTJs would be too. Like he'd be a lot less likely to do that interrupting thing if he was out in like a situation where he was with his family and you know, it was like a social setting. Then he will probably not do that as much. But in a work setting, he feels like this is the important thing I have to interrupt.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like you're here to work, not to talk about.
Right. Yeah.
Not to hear the gossip or whatever. On your own time. It should be work. You should be talking shop. So what was I going to say about? Yeah, I mean, they can develop some self-discipline. Yeah, I like how what Linda Behrens did here, sort of like the temperament is drawing on the, like, where she put temperament first, and then the functions are like tools to achieve the temperament related goals. Does that seem reasonable to you, Jeff, this bit here?
Can meet their needs for impact and freedom best through their process. Yeah.
Reasonable. And then this one.
Yeah, that kind of refers to what I was talking about before. They make sure the world will go on by referencing what has gone before.
Yeah. Yep.
So there's a lot of comparison to, and it's not that I don't ever do that. I do it plenty, but it's just in a different way. I don't know best how to describe that. Like, it's just sort of, for me, it's like, well, yeah, that's a reference point, and I can contrast things and say, things that I enjoyed from the past more. But I guess it just seems like with Guardians that they have this like sort of incredulousness about that. It's like no matter how much things change, they still almost seem surprised that they've changed. It's like they want somebody to confirm to them that they're not the only ones who feel like things have gone off track. Like, it's like, don't you remember when things were good? Like, I'm not the only one, right? And there's just that need to have somebody like validate that.
It's weird. It's like we would sort of need, it would be nice if we could have like a historical record of, say, what were Guardians saying in the 1950s or before, because things have got worse.
Hey, I can do you one better than that. I read a thing that it was an essay by a priest, and it was about how it was saying all these things like children today don't listen to their parents, they get involved in reckless behavior, and it was like this lament about society, and then at the end of it, it said this was written in the year 959.
Yeah. Oh, and I think that even the ancient Greeks might have. But like, we know that in terms of the economy, things have got worse in the United States and Britain over the last 40 years. In terms of like how much, like, people have to work longer hours, their paychecks are not going as far in terms of food and energy. Yes, there's more technology, but people's standard of living in many ways is going down.
Yeah, I think it used to be those kind of things were more in cycles because the people that were in charge of the policy making would sort of present that idea that, oh, we're in one of those periods where things are going to be worse for a period of time, but then they're going to get better. And we just have to sort of ride that wave. And now I think, at least in my country, people just got so spoiled with the attitude of we're supposed to have the things that we want and need all the time that nobody wants to hear that message anymore. Everything always has to be, you're going to get what you want. And if you're not getting what you want, it's this other group's fault. Rather than that kind of attitude of people have to work together and, there's shared sacrifice in certain areas. And then, thing like that mentality seems to be like, at some point people gave up on that. They're like, nobody wants to hear that anymore. You have to just tell people what they want to hear. And if it's not, the facts don't line up, then don't worry about it. Just lie to them.
I think what would happen is Peter Schiff was talking about the fact that he was talking about the Brady Bunch, and he said it was quite common in the 1970s for a family, if both parents were working, that they would be able to afford a servant. And they were talking about, he was talking about the character of Alice, who was a sort of a maid in the Brady Bunch, and he was saying that now you have to have both parents working, or both in a couple, Whereas in the past, only one of them had to work, and if both worked, they could afford a maid. And he was talking about, and Peter Schiff was saying that his father thought the American economy was going to collapse in the late 1970s and the early 1980s. And Peter Schiff said what he didn't realize is that a lot of these women would go into the workforce who used to be housewives in order to pay for government. So there's an example of more and more. And here's something that's true, and especially older people and older guardians, is the fact that a lot of old people in the United States can't afford to retire now because the pension is the Social Security is not enough. Do you think that's true, Jeff? Like, say, 40 years ago, your Social Security people, recipients, could pretty much live off that. Now it's harder to live on.
Well, yeah, because it hasn't kept up with all the other increases. The inflation of everything else. The Social Security hasn't matched that. So yeah, when you have all the prices of everything go up, but then the income level doesn't increase to anything close to that level, then of course it's going to be more difficult.
Yeah. And so the reason I brought this up is, like, this is an example of when you've got people complaining about things aren't as good as they used to be. A lot of the times is you might be a guardian, but you're right anyway.
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah, and that's what I was saying too. Is when I was just thinking in terms of things like entertainment. I talk about how the music was better in the 80s and 90s and stuff. And that's not me saying that because I'm a guardian. So there's guardians out there that are opposite. They pay more attention to what's popular now in whatever particular circle they're in than I do. So.
Yeah, and that's true about the bribery. Or what they do is they have their children on the board of Burisma, and they have their children paid. So, for instance, Joe Biden's son, Hunter, John Kerry's son, Nancy Pelosi's son, Mitt Romney's son, all get paid for being gas experts, and then they pass the money onto the politicians.
Yeah, there's all sorts of collusion in all kinds of areas. It's really like, it's hard. It's hard for there to be any way for that to actually be stopped. It's going to happen. So ideally, here once again comes my bias out. But ideally, if you make it so that the centralized government power is a lot less, then it's a lot harder to take the corruption that will exist to those levels. And the more you localize things, including the corruption, the easier it is to deal with them.
Oh yeah, and also because at a local level they can't print money.
Right. Yeah. There's the more the more you decentralize it, the harder it is for those kind of things to exist. It doesn't mean they can't, because anybody can throw at me and say, "Oh, well, there's corrupt county judges and stuff." Like, yeah, okay, sure there are, but there's also like a better opportunity for the people in that area to put a stop to that than
to replace them.
Far away from.
Yeah, like and it's actually easier in the United States than in Britain. That's sort of like more sort of power at the local level to select local and like school boards and that lot.
Yeah, and it's why it was set up the way to begin with, because the idea when our country was founded that somebody in Philadelphia or New York would have anything to do with the policy making in Arizona or Texas, that was just laughable. Nobody would have been on board with that at all. But now people think that everything has to be that way.
Yeah, so as a public service announcement, I'll explain why the CPI doesn't keep up with inflation. Because there are three things in the CPI. The biggest thing why the CPI understates inflation is that they don't have real rents in the CPI. They have something called owner's equivalent rent, where they ring someone up. So Jeff, well, say you owned your house, and it's like, so Jeff, if you were to rent your place out, how much would you charge yourself? And so that's what they do. They don't put real rents in there. They put owner's equivalent rent in there. And Peter Schiff says you can look at the rents and you can see how much they've gone up, and then when you look at the owner's equivalent rent, it's far less. And a third of the CPI is rents. So that's one way where it's rigged. Another way it's rigged is they have a thing called hedonic adjustments. So they'll say oh, but the television has got better. So if the television is like more expensive, but they'll say, but it's better. And so what they do is they say, well, we'll hedonically adjust this because it's better. We'll say the price has come down because you've got more quality for your money. And then say if something gets expensive, so they use the example of you can't afford steak, so they have chicken. And so they change the basket of goods. And so they call that a substitution. So it's like, oh, the price has not really gone up because you've not bought steak, you've now bought chicken. And so they have these 3 ways to rig the CPI to get the figure down low. And someone called John Williams at shadowstats.com, I'll write that down, shadowstats.com. What he did is he went back and looked at the figures, and I think he's like an ISTJ. What he did, Jeff, is he used the old CPI, the one that they had in 1980, and he ran the numbers from the present, and he worked out that inflation is like literally twice as much as what the CPI says in terms of price inflation. And he talked about all the changes that they made to the CPI. Yeah, so John Williams at shadowstats.com. So that would be a useful place to mention if any kind of party, political people want to mention what the actual rate of inflation really is, or price inflation. It's about 18%, really. Anyhow. Right, so yeah, things are getting worse.
On that happy note.
So I think you mentioned before with TE that you learned a lot of TE stuff just from work, like learning.
I mean, yeah, because I look at that as, you know, the most concrete way I can put that into is like when I need something to be done, because my preference is to not be in a position where I need anything to be done. I would always prefer. So I tell people, like, all the stuff about, you know, you get older and you realize this and that. My preferences haven't changed. I'm always like, I've had a full-time job for a long time now where I have to get up on weekday mornings and go to work. My preference would be to not do that. That's not what and you will hear guardians say, you know, oh, well, if I didn't have a job to go to, you know, I'd be aimless or I'd be bored or whatever. That is not the case for me. I would always have something to do. So my preference, if I just could do whatever I want, would be to sleep however late I wanted to every day, wake up at whatever time, and then decide at that moment, what do I want to do today? To not have any schedule or anything that I was obligated to do would be ideal. And that's very rarely in my life been the case. I can think of isolated situations where I was on a particular vacation or something, but there was always still a deadline where as soon as that time was over, then I was back to being, you know, into the scheduled world or whatever. But so that having been said, because in order for me to, you know, get a paycheck and eat and, you know, be able to afford my rent and all those kind of basic things, there are things that I have to do. And there are things that I need other people to do, because my job is not just me sitting in a room doing some tasks. It's dependent on other people. So when I need those other people to do things, the easiest way for me to do that is to be as simple and direct and linear as possible in terms of these are the steps. So I need you to do A, B, and C. And if you don't understand how to do A, B, and C, I will do my best to explain it to you. But in a lot of cases, I don't really have time to do that, or I'm not the best person to do that. So my immediate thing under the outline of B or C has to be to ask someone else. You know, it has to be ask this person if you don't know how to do that, because it's not my job to explain that to you. My job is to just say A, B, and C are the things you need to do. And I need those things done, because in order for me to do my A, B, and C, I have to have those A, B, and C things done. And so that's also the way that, you know, I approach when I'm talking to someone in whatever context, where even if it's not necessarily in the viewpoint of me saying I need this person to do things for me, it can just be me trying to explain my point of view. And I realize that if I talk in kind of more feeling language that may be sort of more natural to me, that a lot of people are either put off by that or just flat out don't understand it. So if I'm trying to explain something in a way that makes sense logically, then the natural way for me to do that is that same method, is to say, okay, here are the 3 or 4 points of whatever it is in this order, and follow me in this very simple, direct way of doing that. And of course, my son and I have lots of discussions about that, because his method of thinking is very different than me, and he's want to point that out on many occasions, and in my opinion, sort of imply that his method of that is superior to mine. But I don't really think that's true, but I also acknowledge that mine is simpler, and so in some situations, people feel like it doesn't contain as much. I don't know what the word is, but it doesn't contain as much other elements or other possibilities in it. So it's limited. I think some people view it that way. But to me, I look at it as it's limited for a reason, for clarity's sake, and for the maximizing the potential of the things of understanding and the things being done correctly, whatever it is.
Yeah. Whereas an INTP in your position might try and go through all the nuances and the reasons why for this. And
right. Which in
3 hours later, not get
yeah. And
done.
In most cases, isn't really relevant, in my opinion, to getting an actual task complete.
Like, I remember the NLP guys, they wrote a review of a book by Gregory Bateson, who was probably an NTP, maybe INTP. And they said, simultaneously irrelevant and profound. And I think you could probably say that about most INTP.
Yeah, well, you mentioned my brother earlier. He, really, to me, may be one of the most efficient in speech INTPs that I've ever come across. And that wasn't always the case, but I think that's definitely something he developed a lot better as he got older. And I don't know how much of that was necessity in the workplace or other things, but he doesn't come across as that sort of absent-minded professor stereotype. He really, most of the time, doesn't really come across that way.
I've sort of said that before to people, that despite what the functions say, INTPs can be good at TE if they're working in, say, a STEM field. Like, there's plenty of INTPs working as scientists who get good at TE and working with computers. So they don't have to be sort of the stereotype of the theoretical physicist or the philosopher.
Yeah, and again, of course, thinking about that, my father, being an INTJ, he obviously was one of the biggest influences on my brother growing up, and was his source for all of his computer knowledge and stuff like that at the beginning anyway. And so that influence probably made him naturally better at that than he would have been had he had a different person in that position. I'll just say that. That probably influenced him more in that direction of, because my father was always big on clarity and being observant and all these type of things, that some of which may be against NTP stereotypes, but because he kind of hammered that into him, he probably started doing that at an earlier age than maybe some other NTPs.
I think it's just like, say, in your situation where you've had to learn to do those TE things, that an INTP working in science, working in computing, they're going to have to learn to stick with the methods, to go with the facts, and really develop this. Or even I would say, look at Dave. Like he created the Kersey.com business, didn't he? So he turned his father's typology into a business. And I think he said he did it out of necessity. It wasn't a preference for him, but he was able to do it. So he was able to do some sort of practical thinking.
Yeah, and
Dave is a very theoretical person. uber theoretical person by preference.
Yeah. So part of that was him being able to get people who were better at the things that he was weak at and put those people in the positions they need to be in order to accomplish those things. Because that's a huge part of anything where you're doing business is, you've got to figure out very quickly, you can't do everything yourself, and what are the things that you're not as good at, and finding people that's their strong points, so that part of the business is that all those several different parts are able to stay solid to keep it going.
Yeah, I mean, getting the right people is like so difficult.
That's why I say when it comes to my company that it was a short period of time, but the best we had was there was a period of time where we had 4 general managers that each one was a different temperament. And I said, really, ideally, any company is better served by that being the case. Now, that obviously doesn't mean any one of those individuals is going to be perfect at anything, but it means that those point of views are always have representation, and they offer those things that are unique to their temperament in a lot of different situations.
This person here thinks it's lucky that you had an INTJ father as an ESFP, but I'll just say, well, there's videos where Jeff has talked about that.
Yeah, well, right. There's good and bad parts to that too, of course, in a lot of ways. Because people have asked me sometimes, they're like, well, how did that did having your an INTJ father like to help you develop your shadow self better or something, things like that? And I'm like, I don't know. I mean,
it depends on the person. It's like if you have like an extreme INTJ and like a Paris Hilton sort of stereotype of, I don't know, she's probably middle-aged now, Paris Hilton, I don't know. But like the stereotypical, like say Charlie Sheen, Paris Hilton, like the stereotypical ESFP and an extreme INTJ nerd, they're not going to go well together. They're from different planets. But those people that are more moderate, like a moderate ESFP in terms of preferences, a moderate INTJ, I can see them working together well and being complementary for each other's sort of strengths. And so that's my thoughts on the idea of duality, that people have to be ready for it, that they have to be different halves, different sides of the same coin, rather than 2 completely different coins.
Yeah, and and part of that's so much individual, because it's just how much somebody is willing to interact with people that are very different from them in the way that they approach things. When you figure that out, which a lot of times with, I would say with ESFPs or maybe extroverts in general, like it usually doesn't take that long to figure that out. But how do you deal with that? Do you just go, oh, this person's the opposite of me, so I'm just going to hate them? Or do you say, okay, well, what can I use? What's useful with this person? How can I connect with them and use what things we're different on to be a positive thing? So, and so much of it is an individual's openness to working with somebody that's very different. So if you just approach it as, well, I can't stand this way of thinking, that way of thinking is just bad, then you're not going to get anywhere with that. And then everybody, we've discussed this before, sort of has, I guess maybe not everybody, but most people sort of have a type and nemesis. If you ask them, is there a type that you seem to not get along with as well as other? And for me, it's always been ENTJs rather than INTJs. And part of that, I think, is that INTJs, we can have like a big clash or difference, but the INTJ may not actually express it. And because they don't, it doesn't really affect me. They might be sitting there stewing internally about whatever it is they hate about me, but if they don't tell me, then it doesn't really affect me. Or if they don't take some action that affects me directly. Whereas ENTJs are much more likely to just go ahead and express whatever that thing is. And again, it's not a conscious thing where I said, oh, this person is ENTJ, therefore I'm not going to attempt to get along with that person. I never have said that. It's just been by coincidence to me. When I've heard or read expressions where I'm like, man, this person just is really off-putting. Like everything that the way that they're expressing stuff is just, repulsing me. And then I'll find out later that the person's ENTJ. And it's like, it's almost uncanny. It's like, I'm like, when I just keep on seeing more and more information about a person where I'm like, man, this is just really an offensive way of expressing things to me. And then I'll find out, oh, it's an ENTJ. So it's not kind of a running joke for me that's, in either direction. Either I find out a person's ENTJ first, and then I'm like, oh, okay, it's only a matter of time until we find the thing that bothers me about them. Or the opposite, when somebody is just turning me off repeatedly, and I'm like, I bet they're an ENTJ.
So. Yeah, I mean, I think it's gonna be, despite the fact of you theoretically having shared functions, it's like you're a 7, Jeff. You really value your freedom, and then you've got an ENTJ that they can be Enneagram 8 fixated, and they can be about controlling people. That's not going to be a good combination, where you really value your freedom and then you've got a controlling ENTJ.
Yeah, the way that I've always looked at it or have expressed to people is that ESTJs I can completely disagree with on something, and sometimes on many things. I can think, well, this is just a very different person, and we don't agree on stuff. But I still can usually sort of see where they're coming from. They're able to express, and I'll go, oh, okay, I get what part of their background or their circumstances or whatever it is about where they come from that leads them to this position. Even if I disagree with it, I can still understand it. With ENTJs, it's like the same disagreements, but I don't know where it's coming from. It seems to come out of nowhere. Like, how could this person possibly believe this insanity? Is the way the way that I feel about it is and I don't know how to, like, even if I look at it as I'm not looking at it as I'm giving up on this person, I'm thinking, okay, how can I connect with the person, find a way for us to find agreement or work together in whatever the thing is. And it's so much harder to me with the ENTJs. And again, I have not known a whole lot of them. So it's a limited number, but it's still consistent. And it seems like the ENTJ I can think of that I've gotten along with the best, we get along as long as we don't go into certain topics. So it's like there's certain topics that just need to be avoided, because if we go there, it's never going to end well. But if we stick to those other things, then we can have perfectly pleasant conversations, and you with some agreement on something.
How are you with these other two types, ENFJ and ENTP?
Yeah, again, this, I thought for a second that was going to be ENTJ was in the same group, but if it would have been that, then instead of ESTJ, I would have said that's like the three. Probably the three most difficult. But ENFJ, I think I have even less experience with. So that's harder for me to judge. It's like, it's possible there's some people that I've known that have been ENFJs that I just didn't know were, got one ex-girlfriend that was, but, and probably some teachers and stuff. I guess maybe it's just what we were talking about earlier with the shared feeling that allows me to maybe have a little bit better relationships with the ENFJ. But I still have experienced the thing of the controlling behavior that you talked about, where ENFJs will frame it in a way where it's always like, well, I'm doing this for your benefit, but they still want to change people. It's like, well, you need to become your best or reach your potential. So you need to change yourself for that reason.
I would find that even more annoying than someone just telling me what to do, because it's like, don't tell me how to develop. Right? Like, you think like, I'm not a project for you to change. Mm-hmm. I'm not a piece of clay for you to mold.
Right.
It's like insulting.
That's I remember some, one of those kind of goofy things that was labeling the types by the less than flattering stereotype of that type, and they had ENFJs as the cult leader. because the idea is that
I can see that. Yeah,
there's somebody that they want to change everything, so they have to collect enough minions to sort of see it their way that they can direct to change things in that particular capacity.
Even Kersey was sort of like intimating that in like his ENFJ profile. No, actually, he put it in the diplomatic intellect in Please Understand Me Too, where he talked about it just intimated towards other kinds of like social control and like just where it gets unhealthy. Right, what's this? I don't know. That's a maybe. I think maybe it's the tertiary TE and it's a work environment. And Jeff is thinking, okay, I understand what you want me to get to do. I know we've got to get this done. So this is just Dario's idea that like clubs are important. So just the idea that, say, for example, you, Jeff, that you would be good at all your SF functions because you have a sensing preference and a feeling preference. And your NT functions would be weaker. Well, your intuitive functions are weaker because you have a sensing preference, and your thinking functions will be weaker because you have a feeling preference. But what I will say is, I remember you showing me that on the MBTI, you scored something like 12.8 in terms of sensing versus intuiting. Is that right?
I don't remember the exact numbers, but that sounds close, yeah.
Yeah, you were somewhere in the middle on that preference.
Yeah, I mean, both the E and the S are not as strong as the F and P in terms of preference percentage, yeah.
Right.
They're still strong enough that I don't have any doubts in that area, but, you know, it's not like it's right at the middle, but it's definitely not as big a difference as the other two preferences.
Yeah, that's just a bit of that someone might dabble in their tertiary function, but then I've said that, but you might use a lot of it, especially the requirements of someone's job. So, for example, that sort of like fits you, like your requirements of your job mean that you got to use some TE. Like it amps up that.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like, you know, I don't know if he still does, but at one point, you know, Morgan was using the term posing or poser.
Yeah.
And that's honestly what it sort of is. It's like I have to pose as sort of I won't say a TE lead or anything, but like I have to sort of put myself in a position where that's the priority in order to accomplish those tasks, because my sort of natural inclination is just to be like, okay, well then don't do it. You know, just it's like you know, I said Morgan had no idea, you know, as he was growing up, how much I really wanted to be like, yes, stay up all night and eat nothing but candy. You know, these things that you want to do, like that's what I'd rather say to you. But then I think that's me dropping that whole responsibility of being a parent in terms of preparing them for beyond childhood. Because if you just have somebody where you just say indulge yourself in everything as a child, then you're just not prepared for having to live your own life where you don't have somebody handing you things and doing those kind of things for you and allowing you to live that way. So yeah, that was still what I would preferred. You know, it would have been like, yeah. And I also don't want to go to my job. So let's just, you know, just travel around and live off the land, or, you know, crash different places or something like that. That's a life, you know, if I could go back in time and say, hey, how would life have been different if I just followed all my actual instincts? But I've also said that I probably would have ended up in prison or dead or something.
Yeah. So maybe that could sort of like if like getting into the activity of labeling stuff as functions, that could be that bit of SI in you, like that bit where it's like, it's not my preference, but you got to be responsible for this bit. This is sort of thing.
Yeah, because I'm observant enough of like human and society and life to be like, okay, I know what the result of doing that is. Even if that is my preference to do that, I know what it leads to. Therefore, I could choose to ignore that and say, well, it's just going to be different for me. And maybe I would somehow luck out and it would be, or I could accept the reality and say, well, it's probably not going to happen. So it's probably better that I do some things I don't really want to do in order to give myself and my son a better opportunity for future situations, for us to have more opportunities to enjoy what we can enjoy in life. So that's the way I looked at it, is, and I'll never know 100%, unless there's some point in afterlife or whatever where you actually get shown some sort of graph or a thing that shows here's every decision you made and here's what happened if you did the other. If that doesn't ever happen, then I'll never know. But I just had to. That's the thing, is people just have to make the best decisions within the context that they're given.
Also, have you learned from a lot of the, because you're interested in the entertainment business, and and a lot of examples of artisans that maybe they were your young star and maybe had too much success early, and they didn't develop responsibility. And
yeah, I mean, you mentioned Charlie Sheen before. Like, yeah. I've often said that if I had the background that he had, if I grew up in Hollywood, had the same things given to me, the same situations, I probably would have turned out very similar to him, because the instincts are very similar. So I can look at his life and say, our circumstances are completely different, therefore I have a very different life. But if I'd had the same circumstances, it might not be that different at all.
Right. So in this part of the theory, it's that NI and TI would be weak functions for you because they're sort of furthest away in sort of this corner, or these three. And I think that's what Dario Nardi's data shows as well, that these top three functions are usually the strongest. And it's like, as I say, like ENFP and ESFP, I think they can use FE, they can be facially expressive, they can be charismatic. Without valuing it, they can use it. So, for example, an ENFP might use FE in that champion role of advocating for a cause. And but they're doing it, it's using FE for sort of NFE reasons rather than for its own sake.
And that's where we get into the area where I think it's a little bit too much trying to fit things into a box or a diagram, because I don't necessarily buy that facial expression is necessarily a different type of feeling.
Well,
that it only has to be classified as extroverted feeling, or, because the way I've always viewed my feelings is they just sort of spill out.
Right.
So my face expresses itself all the time, and it's not voluntary most of the time. I'm not expressing something to be seen as expressing something. It just comes naturally.
Well, what I could say is a lot of IT types, those types with INT, usually don't have a very expressive face. Like when I was younger, and especially like there's two types that theoretically are really bad at FE, and they tend to have reduced affect display, and that is ISTJ and INTJ. They usually do not show a lot in their face. And so that's an area where it can sort of like, what I think is what the theory predicts, that part of FE, like if you then look at the face of, say, ESFJ, more sort of expressive. And so I just think that maybe if we not talk about functions, but if we talk about those people with E and F, they tend to have an expressive face. People with E and F preferences. And then what we do is from that, we model that and say, so it's like E and F preferences is like what's real. And then the made up function is what we label it as, like, or rather the function that correlates to the preferences.
I just don't want to seed that.
That's fair enough, because I know it's like this. It's I'll put it like this, 2 boxes. And I sort of know the limitations of it as well. Like when I do these videos, I'll talk about, well, this bit doesn't quite work, but like it gives you a little bit here. But there's so Jeff, is NI weird to you the way it is to me? It's just this weird thing that's hard to understand.
Yeah, I think I was, again, in conversation with my son yesterday or the day before. I was saying that just
Yeah,
like with the SI, I reached a point in my life where I was able to see some things that could possibly be the positive version of that, as opposed to early on in life, it only being like more of the paranoid kind of, you know, here's all the ways that things could go wrong, or here's all the negative possibilities. And as I got older, I started to see, okay, um, the example that we were talking about was having a conversation with somebody and figuring out in the course of the conversation that there are certain responses or certain directions that you could go in that you are able to determine is not a good idea because of the person you're talking to. You figure out from what the person is expressing that, like, I can foresee the possibility of, if I respond in this way or if I take the conversation in this direction, it's only going to lead to a bad reaction or negative response. This is not going to end up fruitful, so I'm not going to do that. So that's the kind of thing where I can say this is probably an example of using that in a positive way,
yeah,
as opposed to it just being like thinking about all the ways that the government is spying on you or whatever, whatever sort of the Dale Gribble style of of NI stuff of it being all a bunch of, here's all the conspiracies that
yeah.
are against me.
I think that what helps me a lot to explain NI is to talk about the Kersey roles of, say, mentoring. Like for NFJs, they seem to be good at developing people, and NTJs seem to be good at developing projects. And so what we could say is that if you're coordinating resources towards a long-term objective, it's like you're thinking about what can go wrong and what to do, and you also have to have like practical thinking. And so we can say, if we look at that activity and we could sort of label that activity as, okay, that sort of matches the idea of NI being used with TE. And then when someone's guiding somebody else, that you could say, okay, this matches NI with FE and probably some FI as well. And we can see that sort of working together. So it's like on a social plane, it's like I can sort of say, this is what NI can do for you. I can't really tell you what it is, but I can tell you what NJs are good at. That sort of thing. NFJs are good at, and NTJs.
Yeah, I can more often do that than try to get into the weeds of all that stuff.
And it does seem to be the opposite of SI in terms of SI is about stabilizing, like keeping it consistent with the past, like going to what works. And there is that development aspect to NI. Develop people, develop projects, going towards improvement. And I added this bit today after I did an event. Yeah, I mean, like, it's so hard. So it'll probably end up being 5 episodes. Jonathan, Haley, and I have been doing an event on NI on Haley's channel. We're sort of uploading it in parts. Yeah, they were getting into all of this kind of stuff where they were saying that they just know stuff, but they can't explain it to me. And it's like this. I get an idea that it's like this wonderful world that they can't actually communicate to others. And then part of me thinks, is this real? Is this just NI propaganda? So, because you've seen that, Jeff, like probably in posts, haven't you? Or people talking about NI where they make it sound like a magical power, like a sci-fi.
Yeah, I think it's some people are a little too confident about their projections sometimes, but
Yeah.
that doesn't mean that there isn't some insight that they may have. It's maybe not quite as like you say, magical.
Yeah.
It could just be that there's a certain less obvious cues they're able to pick up.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, it can develop. It does seem to, like I said, when you look at the NJs and see what they do well, then there seems to be that developing foresight aspect to it. Yeah, but ENTJ, but it also according, but that's also about the role though, Fate, because he makes a distinction between mobilizing as the field marshal and then the INTJ contingency planning. But he says that, so in the case of ENTJ, they're sort of like, the role would be the hierarchical, then it's like their first sort of predisposition. And then their second predisposition would be that kind of planning. So this is, I always mention that distinction between type and role. And the that strategic building is an intellect that all types can do. It's just that the NTJs are sort of set up to be best at that. And I would say it's because strategic coordination draws on the functions that the NTJs are best at. So that was the idea that there's maybe part of the ESFP that's attracted to INTJ. I know when I've asked it the other way around that the NJs do tend to be attracted towards SPs. But maybe that's because you just think that artisans are awesome. So what's not to be attracted to?
I mean, that is a good point.
Yeah. So I remember asking, I asked Alexis Kingsley, and she said that she finds musicians attractive. And so she's INTJ. And Haley, they said that she thinks her first boyfriend was a artisan. Right, so I won't go into that. That Vanderhoop's features of intuition. That's a bit much. Oh yeah, so could you tell me, Jeff, that sort of like your sort of experience of when you think you use NE? I think you said you get into that state and sometimes you deliberately make yourself tired.
No, that happens naturally. I don't deliberately make myself tired.
But I think, did you say that you think you get a little bit more NE when you get tired?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of formed that theory a while back that you know, because I noticed that I really didn't think about it much until I just sort of assumed that everybody was like this, that, you know, the more tired I got, the more just kind of random in terms of the thoughts I expressed. You know, it'd be more sort of goofy ideas. And, you know, sometimes if I was like writing lyrics or something like that, it would start being much more metaphorical or just kind of all over the place. And I figured that everybody was the same in that until I started, when I had first got into reading about typology stuff, and I heard intuitive type people telling me that when they got tired, that they felt actually more in touch with the physical world. They were sort of hypersensitive to what was around them physically, because it was like their brain that was normally thinking of all this conceptual stuff, it was like it was harder to do that. When they got tired, those things would shut off more and they would sort of just be more present in the physical world, which is the opposite of what I was expressing. So I thought, oh, this, even before I really delved into any of the stuff about shadow types or anything like that, I sort of saw evidence of that in people from just that thing about, you know, what happened when they got tired. So yeah, for me, it's, you know, just some of my more outlandish ideas or expressions have come about when I was tired, which is also ties into my theory that that there's a lot of writers that get labeled as intuitives, whether it's songwriting or comedy writing or different things like that, where it's probably just that they spent hours and hours without sleep and coming up with whatever it is they were trying to write. And the more tired they got, the more like, you know, random and intuitive like their expression got. So what the finished product ends up as seems to be more that way, when it may have just been a product of either being tired or in some cases drug use, obviously, which can have the same effect.
for me, my brain just sort of turns to mush, and I stop being able to think. And I think I did some events with Jeff where it's like, Ben's starting to get a bit tired. He said I'd sound like Colonel K. So,
yeah. Danger Mouse, if anybody doesn't know what he's referring to.
Is that true?
Like,
I'm not good when I get tired.
My favorite talk show host, Mark Davis, is the same way. I start saying he sounds like Porky Pig because he does a little of the blah, blah, blah.
So this you might because Dario's research is for a while he said that he had a no lefties rule. He didn't want to EEG left-handers because their brain activity wasn't consistent with the type activity. That I think he said that the brain activity of left-handers, like half of left-handers would be like a mirror image of the brain activity of the right-hander, and then the other half just had completely weird brain activity that was like unique to themselves, sort of like no patterns across people of the same type.
It wouldn't surprise me, of course, if I was just weirdly brained on everything, but I don't know that I would.
Maybe you're saying that
for all I know, like as much as I wouldn't want to accept it, for all I know, I'd be very predictable. I really don't know.
Yeah. So you might be, you were saying that you might be left-handed because you were saying that when you were younger that you said that the left-handed scissors felt more natural.
Yeah, I got basically told at an early age that I mean the general thing was that I was too timid to kind of respond to it, but I basically was taught to be right-handed, and I just accepted it because I thought that was what I was supposed to be. And it might sound strange coming from an artisan type to say, well, I did this thing because I thought I was supposed to be, but it went beyond something where you think, oh, this is something where I can rebel and do the opposite thing. It was more like I just thought it was like my body was convinced by them saying that, like I almost was afraid to try to do this other way because I thought, oh, I'm not going to be able to do that. So there's a part in Please Understand Me Too, I believe it is, where Kersey talks about like artisans don't want to show skills to people until they've like got it up to a level where they can show it off. Yeah. There was a lot of things like that for me. Reading was one of them. My mother likes to talk about how that they didn't know I could read as young as I did because I didn't like let anybody know that. And again, it was more down to fear. I was embarrassed like when I would attempt to read and be bad at it.
Right.
I didn't want to come off as bad in skills like that. So it was the same thing with writing. I was terrible at writing, but at no point in those discussions that I was in there for did anyone from my parents to teachers to counselors, anything suggest that maybe I should try writing left-handed. It was always all these other methods that they tried to actually write. And I did eventually get better at writing, but I'm still like, if I write just naturally with my right hand, I write very messy. Like I have to concentrate really hard to write in a way that is readable to anyone else. But because I never practiced left-handed writing, I mean, I did, but I just not very often. It's even worse, in terms of like just basic writing. But if I concentrate with the left hand, I can pretty much write as neatly as I can when I concentrate with the right hand. So I like to people talk about ambidextrous, and I say, well, I'm the opposite of that. I'm bad with both hands because I sort of had I guess you could say, stunted growth in a way where I didn't practice the thing with my natural preference. So I learned over time to use the unnatural preference. Never got good at it.
There's an example of a footballer, of a soccer player, who I think it was George Best, that he was right-footed, but he actually developed his left foot better just through practice.
Yeah, there's a tennis player, Sabina Appelmans from Belgium, and she was in just in a children's tennis group when she was like 4 or 5 years old, and they divided them up. and her best friend or the one person that she knew in the group was left-handed, so she went with her group because she wanted to be in her group, and she learned tennis left-handed. So, and I did the opposite, where I originally learned tennis right-handed, and then went back and started at the beginning and learned it again left-handed. So,
so it might be. So were you better left-handed at tennis?
I mean, now I definitely am. I don't. It's impossible for me to go back and know whether I would have been if I had continued to practice as often and as much as I did right-handed. I don't know whether I'd be at the same level now or better or worse. It's hard for me to know that.
So there's a thing called cross-dominant where you use one hand for one thing and another hand for the other. Are you a bit cross-dominant where there's certain things that you use your left hand better than your right hand?
Yeah, and because of that, like for so much of my life, I wasn't really even aware. It was just something I didn't really think much about. And now there's times in which I think a little too much about it, because I'll be doing something and I'll sort of almost confuse myself, because I'm like, wait a minute, which hand is better to use in this situation? I don't know. So obviously I just have to pick one, but there's times in which I'm kind of like, if I don't think about it and I just let myself pick the thing that's natural, then it's better. But if I even stop for a split second to think about which hand I should use, it's almost like I'm paralyzed, like my brain gets confused and doesn't know what I should do.
Yeah, also, so I think there's some evidence that left-handed people are more creative than right-handed people on average. And so maybe what you could get is you could get a lot of, say, Paul McCartney, left-handed ISFP. So there's certain, just in terms of the neuroscience, left-handed people can have. So you know what I mean? Was Prince left-handed? Sabrina's probably watching this. Was Prince left-handed?
I think so. And then it's funny you bring that up, because that's not something I wasn't even aware of until I was an adult. Like as a kid, you mentioned the scissors. Like I was aware of a few things like that existed as like a different left-handed version, but I did not even think about like musicians, like things like a guitar or something that there was actually different, that specially made versions for using left hand. Like it never even occurred to me until I was an adult. Can't think of a single instance that ever crossed my mind. Like I wasn't even aware. Like I see Paul McCartney and Prince and people perform, and I just never thought about it. It's like, it wasn't like I was unobservant. It never occurred to me to think about what hand are they playing the instrument with. It just wasn't something I even considered until, stories that I heard as an adult that brought it up. And then I was like, oh yeah, I never thought about that before.
Yeah. So maybe there's something in that about, because it's like, I don't like creativity being like, there's a lot of like bigotry with typology where like everyone who's creative, they immediately type them as an intuitive. I'm like, that is just wrong. Whereas I sort of see it like in my subfunctions function system, I think every function can be used in a creative way or an imaginative way. It's not just all creativity is like NE or NI. It's like each function can have its sort of creative or imaginative. And what I say is, I say the extroverting functions have a creative subfunction and the introverting functions have an imaginative subfunction.
Well, yeah, I mean, it goes back to come almost full circle what I said near the beginning about Kevin James as a Guardian comedian using the constantly comparing things to the old days.
Yeah.
So there's an example of if that's classified as SI, there's a creative use of it, using it for stand-up comedy.
Yeah. I do think in that case it's like a combination of SI and NE, in that you're finding the connections in memories into the past. Because I do see NE as about the finding the connection, like here, seeing the commonalities. Because ISTPs and ISFPs don't like looking at commonalities. They like to keep things separate. So their songs tend to have more focus. I remember reading the Pat Patterson books. He was always, I've read about 3 or 4 of his books, and he always writes about prosody, and that a song must have a central theme and the elements must work together. So, for example, if the feeling is unstable, then you should have the length lines unstable and the rhyme types not perfect. And so it all sort of like all these different like tactics are sort of like reinforcing each other to get a method of to get a feeling across of uneasiness. Whereas where you want it more stable, then you would have perfect rhymes, and the line lengths would be the same. So it's like just a way to like thematic integration. And then the way he described what he thought was a bad song was a song that talked about bad things happening in America and then going to another country and talking about different bad things. And it made me think, that sounds like a song by an NFP. And so he doesn't like that kind of hopping around from topic to topic, like stick to one topic and explore it. And so I thought of that. So he mentioned you with Any, and left-handed private chat, right? Yes. Facebook message. Let's see your Facebook message. Right. We're having a moment, folks, whilst I have a look at Jeff's Facebook message. I don't even know if I said that word properly. Facebook.
Was trying to be subtle about it, and then Ben had to make it exactly the opposite.
Yeah. Okay, I know what you mean. Yeah, we're near the end. So, right, TI. So the last one, is it? Right. So TI, Jeff. I think you once said that it's buried in a chest at the bottom of the ocean.
Mm-hmm.
Your TI.
Yeah, that was, of course, the subject of the same discussion I was talking about from a day or two ago with my son. And I sort of said, well, despite that, me saying that, I think there are obviously some contexts where I'm able to probably use that in some way. I'm just not really good at being able to point out where and when. But I'm sure that I do.
I think you're good at pointing holes in like a theory. Like because sometimes I'll put a theory out there and I don't mind if it's shot down because like I find out what's wrong with it, because it's not something I'm attached to. It's like I'll just put a thought out there and like you're able to find a hole in it. So I think
well, that's one thing I do all the time is that, and it goes back to when I did that MBTI step 2 and it showed the breakdown of the TF preference where I called it my T middle finger because I had the one thing in the middle that was all the opposite direction preference on the T side, whereas I call myself 100% F. But it's obviously when you break it down, there's a reason why some people, when they talk to me or read things I say, will mistype me as a T because they encounter that part of it, which is mainly my probing questions and challenging people's assertions. Because to me, that's just, I see it as more of an SP temperament thing, is that we don't just swallow what somebody tells us and just say, oh, well, we just accept that because you said so. It's like my entire being is like, really, how do you know that? Where do you get that from? How do you know that's true? What about this? What about that? It's everything is, don't let the balloon just keep on, I got to pop the balloon, whatever you want to say, whatever stupid metaphor that I'm not good at. But, I don't, it's not about being difficult or trying to put anybody down at all. It's just you float an idea and I can see the good things in that, but I can also see the flaws, and I'm going to try to either understand better what you're saying or improve what you're putting out there by asking those questions and by pointing out the nuances or the exceptions to the thing you're putting out.
Yeah, because it's just something that's being floated out. Because I know in this area it's theory. Now, if it was economics, I'm a lot more. But we probably agree on many things, like because like if it's like libertarian economics, it's like because like I know this to be true.
Even on that, I mean, anything that's like too buried in numbers or in theoretical stuff when it comes to economics. I have no interest in that. I'm not going to understand most of it, and no matter how much time I spend on it. Yeah. So I focus if I'm in any way thinking about economics, it's a very people-focused thing, like everything else. It's how does this actually affect people on a direct basis? And if there's something we can do to improve this, then what is the practical effect, and what can be done about that, as opposed to sort of just hypothesizing about possibility.
Yeah, because what Austrian school economics does is it takes the numbers out of it and it treats it as, what would this person do in this situation who's just trying to go the rational. And it's like the Austrian school economics pretty much knows that people will change their behavior based on it. So, for example, I think even Ronald Reagan once said that what you tax, you get less of, and what you subsidize, you get more of. Mm-hmm. People will change their behavior in relation to the government's policy. And so governments never collect as much tax as what they think they will by introducing the tax, because people rearrange their lives in order not to pay.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously we've talked about it before, and it's a whole nother video in itself, but the attempting of manipulation by the Federal Reserve and things like lowering interest rates. Well, if you just keep doing that and you leave them artificially low forever, people just, everything adjusts to that, and it's just accepted that this is what this is. So it no longer influences behavior in the way that you originally were intending. It doesn't make people spend money at a higher rate, which is what it initially was supposed to do. Raising interest rates was supposed to make people save money, and lowering them was supposed to make people spend money. And if it always is low or always high, then it's not going to. That just becomes ingrained in the way people operate already. It just comes accepted.
Yeah, I actually think that interest rates can't be too high, because that's just the rate that the central bank would lend to normal banks. And if you've got a load of savings, the interest rate would come down naturally.
Yeah, right. Imagine that, actually letting things happen naturally instead of constant artificial interference.
Yeah, the real thing to do is to, because usually, folks, this is a very TI argument, and Jeff understands this, just trying to get people to understand monetary policy. They don't understand this argument of these economic bubbles are caused by low interest rates, encouraging people to get into debt. And the NTJs out there, they see all this demand for a certain product, but people are buying it on credit, and then they have these projects that don't develop properly. And part of the problem is the Federal Reserve, it's not independent from the government. How can they be independent when it's appointed, where you have the chairman of the Federal Reserve nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate? It's a branch of government, despite what it says. And the reason why they can't do... So, an example, Nabalina's doing a good job as chairman of the Russian Central Bank. But if you put her... and you swapped her around with I've forgotten his name, the head of the Federal Reserve. I've forgotten his name. It was reappointed by Biden. But if you put her in his position, she wouldn't be able to do anything because there's too much debt. It would collapse everything. To do the right thing would collapse everything, because the United States government would go broke. Anyway, so we got to the end, and just have we got anything else? Oh yeah, yes. That's pretty much it. That's the model, overly fancy TI kind of thing. And Jeff's probably thinking, I remember when you had something similar to this, Ben, a few years ago, and you were absolutely convinced about the functions, and it was a different order.
Well, I like the colors, but you'll have to explain to me sometime later when I'm not in the middle of this what the whole club stuff is, because I don't really understand that. So.
Yeah, it's just in this, it's SF. It's like what Myers-Briggs originally had with SF, ST, NT, and NF. But what I do I still put temperament first. So in that, I still think the most important dividing line between the concrete types is SP and SJ rather than ST and SF. But I do think that clubs are important. Yeah. So the club being SF, I mean, Van der Hoek would have called it the anyway, so we better stop because
yeah, I mean, we can do another one some other time if you want to. Just
okay.
You know, I never get tired of talking about myself. So
there we go. So let's just thank you for this, Jeff. I'm now going
no
to
problem. Thanks
end
for
the
inviting me.
broadcast. Okay.